Welcome to the second video in the Band of Friends series, which features 3 of Paul McCartney's friends who appeared on the cover of his Band on the Run album. This video takes a sideways look at Christopher Lee and focuses on his alleged military intelligence wartime service and that of his cousin. It also touches on the contrasting fates of 2 senior Nazi figures and their involvement with British military intelligence. Sir Christopher Frank Carandini Lee, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Most Venerable Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, actor, singer, and military intelligence officer who was knighted for his services to drama and charity in 2009, was also yet another child of military and aristocratic parents. He was born on the 27th of May 1922 in Belgravia, London. His father was Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Trollope Lee, and his mother was Countess Estelle Marie Sazzano. I probably murdered that pronunciation. Lee's parents separated when he was 4 and divorced 2 years later. During this time, his mother took his sister and him to Switzerland. They then returned to London, where his mother married the uncle of Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond novels, and that's how Ian Fleming became Christopher Lee's step-cousin. We'll be looking at him a bit later on in the video. When asked during an interview how he came to know him, the former Beatle replied, "Christopher we'd known from the first early Beatles days. He was making a vampire movie next door, the next door being at Twickenham Film Studios, London, when the Beatles were filming A Hard Day's Night, back in May 1964. The only thing wrong with that story is Christopher Lee's first English vampire movie was filmed in between April and June 1965 at Bray Studios in Berkshire. Still, you can't expect an old Beatle to remember everything exactly, and these days he rarely does. Lee played in more than 250 movies across 8 decades, including Hammer Horror, James Bond, Lord of the Rings, and Star Wars franchises. Too many to name individually, so I'll just list some of my favourites. Of course, he's best known as Count Dracula in the Hammer Horror films. James Bond fans will know he played the role of Francisco Scaramanga in the Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun. Christopher Lee also starred in what I consider to be one of the best B films ever, The Wicker Man in 1973, alongside Britt Ekland and Edward Woodward. Lee considered his role as Lord Summerisle in this Scottish horror film to be one of his best and his favourite film. More recently, Lee played the role of Saruman in both the Lord of the Rings films trilogy and the Hobbit trilogy, which are among my particular favourites. By the late 60s and especially the early 70s, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings inspired music was starting to appear in the progressive rock genre, and the names of the book's characters such as Gollum and Galadriel featured in song lyrics and titles. Of course, long before those albums were released, the Beatles dressed up as wizards in their December 1967 psychedelic flop of a magical mystery tour movie, which was panned by the critics and audience alike. But it was Dennis O'Dell who had the idea of the 4 Beatles to star in their own version of The Lord of the Rings. Dennis O'Dell, who is best known for his association with the Beatles, having worked on their first film, A Hard Day's Night, was the producer of their television film, Magical Mystery Tour. O'Dell's idea involved Lennon playing the character of Gandalf or Gollum, according to which report you read. Paul McCartney would play Frodo, George Harrison playing Gandalf, if Lennon took the part of Gollum, and Ringo Starr would play Sam. It all seems a bit too weird even for the psychedelic 60s, and certainly for J.A.R. Tolkien, who vetoed the project. Incidentally, Christopher Lee was the only member of the cast and crew ever to meet Tolkien. Ian Fleming's James Bond books and subsequent movie franchise turned out to be something of a phenomenon, and one of the longest continually running film series in history since the release of Dr. No in October 1962, which coincided with the release of the Beatles' first single, Love Me Do. It seems there's always some military intelligence involvement when it comes to people the Fab Four liked. In this case, it's Christopher Lee, the World War II intelligence officer, who would coincidentally go on to appear in another intelligence officer's creation, Ian Fleming's James Bond film, The Man with the Golden Gun. Incidentally, Paul McCartney's Wings performed the title song for the 1973 Bond film, Live and Let Die, so he and Christopher Lee have a bond in common. 5 years earlier, Christopher Lee starred in the movie version of his friend's best-known book, Dennis Wheatley's The Devil Rides Out, which was released in America under the title of The Devil's Bride. Based on Dennis Wheatley's 1934 novel, The Devil Rides Out, became a Hammer film production classic and was released in 1968, once censorship worries over Satanism had eased and received favourable reviews. Almost forgotten today, Dennis Wheatley was one of the greatest British writers of bestsellers of the 20th century. His books on black magic and Satanism, The Devil Rides Out, The Satanists, They Use Dark Forces, and To the Devil a Daughter, remain as entertaining today as when they were first written. The Devil and All His Works was an attempt to write a serious book on the phenomenon of devil worship, and it is where I first learned about Aleister Crowley. Both Dennis Wheatley and Ian Fleming based characters in their books on Aleister Crowley. Charles Gray played MacArthur, the character Wheatley based on Aleister Crowley representing the forces of evil in the movie The Devil Rides Out. Gray is probably known as the arch-villain Ernst Stavro Blofeld, the head of Spectre, in a James Bond film Diamonds Are Forever, who I think could easily have been modelled on the real-life Nazi Martin Bormann. And he also played Dicko Henderson, a British intelligence officer, in a previous Bond film, You Only Live Twice. Let's connect a few British intelligence dots. According to the books I've read, Tom Dryburgh, Labour Party chairman, Privy Councillor to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, and rumoured MI5 KGB double agent, introduced Aleister Crowley to Devil Rides Out author and MI5 officer Dennis Wheatley. Dennis Wheatley introduced Crowley to Maxwell Knight, BBC Children's presenter and real James Bond M-figure and head of MI5, who was also one time under suspicion of being a KGB mole. Which may seem odd considering that Knight's biography indicates that he was an ardent fascist. Knight also had a keen interest in the occult, especially black magic. It seems probable that he tapped into Crowley's vast reservoir of knowledge on all things occult for practical counterintelligence purposes. Crowley kept in contact with German occultists throughout World War II and fed them false information. At this point, some will no doubt be thinking about the song Maxwell's Silver Hammer. which some like to associate with the alleged death of Paul McCartney in 1966 or thereabouts. But Knight retired from the security service in 1961 and died of heart failure at age 67 on the 27th of January 1967, more than 2.5 years before the release of the Beatles' Abbey Road album, where the song appears. Here's an overview of those band of intelligence friends, Maxwell Knight being the most senior in rank at the top. Christopher Lee's intelligence connections with those close friends and relatives are shown in the lower right-hand corner. Besides playing in horror movies, Lee became obsessed with the occult in real life, and had a library of 12,000 books on the subject, ever since he read Aleister Crowley. Lee said it was his friend Dennis Wheatley who got him interested in the occult. Naval Intelligence Officer Ian Fleming's connection with Aleister Crowley sprang out of the arrival in Scotland in 1941 of Nazi chief Rudolf Hess, who created an international sensation when he secretly flew to Scotland on an abortive self-styled mission to negotiate a peace between Britain and Germany. Hess was found not guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials, and was sentenced to life imprisonment at Spandau Jail, Berlin. He was found dead on the 17th of August 1987, aged 93. He supposedly hung himself using an extension cord strung over a window latch. Yet his son repeatedly claimed that his father had been murdered by British intelligence to prevent him from revealing information about British misconduct during the war. Hess was the sole inmate at Spandau prison, which after his death was demolished in 1987 to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Christopher Lee's step-cousin had a fantastic, if not fantastical, World War II, on a level with his British intelligence creation, James Bond, or at least on a par with those comics that many a British schoolboy read during the 1960s. For nearly 2 decades from 1961, when titles such as Victor and Commando were first published, young British boys like me were refighting the Germans and the Japanese via illustrated comics. Those 60s boys' comics had roots that went back to the 1940s, when publishers fought to win over the hearts and minds of British children during the Second World War, and the Beano and the Hotspur both trumpeted the importance of the nation's war effort to youngsters as young as 8. With comics using vibrant front covers and witty storylines that were used to ridicule Hitler and undermine the Nazis, while championing the ideal of the plucky British underdog. By modern standards, even the 60s versions of these comics wouldn't be considered politically correct. Ian Fleming's wartime operation, if true, would have had an enormous impact on the financing on what would later be a modern rebuilt Germany, at the centre of a European Union. Hailed as the last great secret of the Second World War, the book Operation James Bond by Christopher Crichton tells the story of Ian Fleming's raid to snatch Hitler's right-hand man, Martin Bormann, out of the ashes of Berlin in 1945, before the Russian army arrived. Published as non-fiction, but regarded by some as a novel, Christopher Crichton's book is said to reveal for the first time exactly what happened to Bormann at the end of the war. As the Soviets closed in on Berlin, Bormann was allegedly taken to England by a commando raiding party led by Ian Fleming. The operation is said to have had the backing of both Churchill and Roosevelt, and resulted in as much as 95% of Nazi funds being recovered and restored to their former owners. Operation James Bond's plot to extract one top Nazi from wartime 1930s Berlin would sound rather far-fetched if we knew nothing about the previously secret Operation Paperclip US intelligence program that brought over 1,600 German and Austrian scientists and engineers to the United States after World War II, many of whom were former leading Nazi Party members. The CIA mind control program MK-Ultra was essentially the continuation of work that began in Japanese and Nazi concentration camps. Christopher Lee's step-cousin, Commander Ian Fleming, may not have had anything to do with Operation James Bond. But, as we will see, often the facts are seemingly revealed in fiction when it comes to Ian Fleming's Bond books and movies. After the war, Bormann was convicted and sentenced to death in absentia for crimes against humanity. Absentia is Latin for absence. In absentia, a legal term, is Latin for in the absence, or while absent. So where was Bormann, and what was he up to? As documented in Paul Manning's book Nazi in Exile, anticipating the defeat of the Third Reich, Reichsleiter Martin Bormann set up 750 corporations in neutral countries, primed as vehicles to receive the liquid wealth of Germany, in addition to patents and other proprietary industrial information. Paul Manning was an American broadcast journalist and not a modern-day conspiracy theorist, who worked closely with Edward R. Murrow during World War II as a correspondent for CBS Radio, and with the Mutual Broadcasting System later on in the war. The organisation was called Die Spinne, which is German for the spider, probably because of its vast web of front companies. One banker quoted by Manning termed the Bormann organisation as the world's most important accumulation of money power under one control in history. Controlling Germany's major corporations, the Federal Republic itself, and much of Latin America, the Bormann organisation also maintained a formidable circle of influence in the United States, according to Manning. Bormann's real-life organisation is depicted as an octopus and called Spectre in Ian Fleming's fictional Bond movies, which I'm sure many James Bond fans will have heard of. Manning paid dearly for his efforts to expose Bormann's post-war network. He was actively marginalised, and his family suffered economic hardship as a result. When Manning was finally able to get Lyle Stewart Incorporated to publish the book, Lyle Stewart had both his legs broken the week before the book was published. Eventually, Paul Manning's son Jerry was murdered in retribution for the Bormann research, and as a warning against publishing a follow-up volume in search of Martin Bormann. So it looks like someone was taking the so-called fiction surrounding Bormann's escape to freedom very seriously. Officially, Martin Bormann's remains were found in West Berlin in 1972, and were positively identified as his in 1998 using DNA tests. Yet, despite his skeleton being found in the yellow, sandy soil typical of Berlin, the skull was covered with thick red clay comparable to that of a region of Paraguay in South America, where he is rumoured to have died in 1959. Despite all the other remarkable things that Christopher Lee is said to have got up to during his eventful life, It's his alleged wartime adventures that interest me the most, in part I suppose due to the World War II influences I had been exposed to as a child, and all those comic book heroes and their adventures. Christopher Lee's wartime adventures started with him reportedly running away from home to join the Finnish army in their fight against the Soviet Union at the ripe old age of 17. Except Guy Walters of the British newspaper The Daily Mail finds this account to be dubious. According to the journalist and historian, around 8,500 British citizens volunteered to help the Finns during the Winter War, but only 200 actually travelled to the country, and nearly a year prior to when Lee claimed he did. Additionally, Walters finds it difficult to believe the Finnish army would have accepted schoolboys to fight. Less than a year later, he was off to fight the Nazis in World War II. He initially tried to join the British Royal Air Force, but was denied entry due to health issues with his optic nerve. The story goes that he transferred to their intelligence division, where he quickly climbed the ranks. Lee later made a number of claims regarding his time in the RAF. He allegedly spent time in the Special Air Services, SAS, and the Long Range Desert Group, LRDG, as well as the Special Operations Executive, SOE. The Long Range Desert Group was a reconnaissance and raiding unit of the British Army during the Second World War. It was formed specifically to carry out deep penetration, covert reconnaissance patrols, and intelligence missions from behind Italian lines during the North African campaign, and were sometimes assigned to guide other units, including the Special Air Service, SAS, and secret agents across the desert. Historian Gavin Mortimer, a writer for The Spectator and a researcher into the role of the SAS during World War II, said that while Lee wasn't necessarily lying about his service, he may be guilty of exaggerating. Quote, "In reality, he served in none of the elite military units. He was attached to the SAS and Special Operations Executive as an RAF liaison officer at various times between 1943 and 1945, but he did not serve in them." End of quote. Mortimer also takes issue with Lee's claim that he wasn't at liberty to speak about his missions, saying, quote, "Nonsense. Wartime members of those special forces units are not, and never have been, prevented from discussing operations." End of quote. Some less discerning parts of the mainstream media would have us believe that Christopher Lee was a real-life James Bond, and was a Nazi hunter working with British military intelligence during World War II, and gained notoriety for his success in capturing and subsequently interrogating Nazi war criminals. Perhaps that's where his ability to speak 4 languages came in handy: French, Italian, Spanish and German. Italian and German being the languages of the 2 enemies that he faced. Yet his claim to have hunted German war criminals is also disputed and involves the way Lee described his job, which is different to how others explained it. Lee said he would come into contact with a German soldier, interrogate and then turn them in. However, British personnel in this position didn't participate in field work and were instead stationed in offices. But he certainly didn't catch Martin Bormann. When asked about the Second World War, Lee would give vague answers. As the Daily Mail's Guy Walters concluded, Lee buffed up his membership of perfectly respectable units in order to give the appearance that he was involved in similar but far more exciting work. In contrast, Paul Manning's factual book detailing his investigation into the apparently successful escape to freedom of Martin Bormann rarely receives any attention, let alone reported in the mainstream media. Such are the politics of history, I suppose. There are some facts that simply don't tie in with the comic book version of events, especially when the goodies have secretly colluded with the baddies. It's perhaps not surprising that the World War II military intelligence and occult connections that appeared on the Sgt. Pepper front cover would resurface in the guise of Christopher Lee on McCartney's Band on the Run album cover.